Masechet Batra Daf Pehe Amud Aleph, 8 lines down. We're now going to talk about whether or not an item can be used, a utensil, my bucket. Can they be acquired? Can I acquire something with my bucket even in public? Tashma will bring a proof. Long one. Arba midot b'mochrin. There are 4 separate halachot regarding sales. Ad shelod mitmal al midel mocher. If the measure is not full, meaning if I didn't acquire the measurement, if the produce was not loaded in fully, then then it still belongs to the seller. But once the measurement is filled, it now belongs to the buyer. When does that apply? That only applies when the utensil used is not by, it doesn't belong to either of them. But it belong to one of them, then either the seller retains each piece as it goes in, or if the buyer belongs to the buyer, then he acquires each portion as it goes in. But when does that apply? That only applies you're able to acquire ding 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 if it's public or if it's a location that does not belong to either of them. But in case the buyer is acquired until he picks it up, or he removes it from the seller's property. But it's in the buyer's property. Once the seller agrees to sell it, the buyer immediately acquires it. If we're still in the middle of the proof, by the way, if the sale happened in the third party's property, it's literally in the property where in my warehousing doesn't belong to me, but it's the place where I left it. The buyer doesn't acquire it until the guy, the owner of this facility, agrees to loan it to the buyer. Then he acquires like that. Or actually, he's going to more. He could rent, or alternatively, he could rent that location. So what do we see from here? The basic point is we said clearly in a public property or in a quarry that does not belong to either of them. My love seemingly in public property. The buyer's utensil the bucket can be used to acquire something from the seller, even though he doesn't have quote unquote rights to that location. Bomb question. The Gemara says la simta. It's referring to simta, the place that mutually have usage. The Gemara says, but it specifically said that it's like a courtyard doesn't belong to either of them, which is like public. Not a simta. Simta sounds like it is have access. The Gemara says yes, but no. What does it mean that it's not either of them? It doesn't belong to either of them completely. If the belongs to both of them, like a simta. Okay, no proof. Next question. If the produce was placed in the buyer's bucket while it was in the seller's property, my bucket, his property, does the buyer acquire or not? The mother says that I do have a Mishnah. Famous case, and we're about to see why it was famous. Because if the case is, if let's say the husband throws a get to the wife and has a chance to acquire it, what if he throws it into her lap and or to her basket, her sewing basket? The Mishnah says she's divorced, seemingly, even in a case where the basket's resting on the floor of the husband's property. Seemingly, you're able to acquire with your utensil in someone else's property. Bomb question. Turning on the air conditioner. Or it says, no, why are you bringing the proof from this Mishnah on Gitin? That we smashed it 100 times with a stick. Meaning, you can't bring me a proof from this Mishnah. We delved into this 1,000 times why this Mishnah is not so clear cut. Because why? They established the Mishnahs in different cases that it's not so pashut. Either the case of the bet where the get landed in the basket, whether it was hanging from her, different case, different explanation. The basket's tied to her, even though it's not hanging necessarily. It's just the rope. Different explanation. The basket was was on the ground, but between her thighs. That's why it acquired. It's like it's her own spot. The case where the husband sells baskets, and therefore, if she has her own basket there, obviously he lets her have that location. No, it's by her lap, and therefore her lap acquires it. Or her basket, same thing. My time how come Rabbi Yochanan holds that? The person is not makpid, he doesn't care. not strict on the spot that's occupied by the wife's lap, and not the spot occupied by her basket. So we see from here that in all these cases, all said and done, the proof from the Mishnah that the woman acquires it in the husband's possession is not a good proof, because we establish it many different ways that it's not so clear cut and dry that it's in the husband's possession per se, but rather she has access. So next, it's bringing from the farm Braita. This sale happened while in the seller's property. The buyer does not acquire it until he lifts it up or removes it. So sounds like malav since the blokeach. Seemingly, even if it's in the buyer's utensil, and still we see that you don't acquire it until you take it out. So when it says not a good proof, because the macher is referring to the seller's utensil, and therefore he has to remove it. When it says that first part of the baita is referring to the case where it's the seller's utensil. The second part of the baita also to be seller's utensil. But the problem is, the second part of the baita specifically says that the sale happened in the buyer's property. And once the seller accepted the terms, he accepts the price. The buyer acquires it. But if we just established this braita fully that it's in the possession in the seller's utensil, rather, you can acquire it even if it's in the buyer's possession. Where it says no. The second part of the braita is actually talking about the buyer's utensil. Where it says my pascha. Whoa. Now you what? You're telling me the first part of the braita is referring to seller, second part of the braita is buyer. Where it says yeah. Specifically because the first part of it is referring to the case of the seller's property, and therefore we're talking about the seller's utensils as well, because that's where it's common to happen. And vice versa, in the second part of the Baita, where we're talking about the buyer's property, of course it's going to be talking about the buyer's utensils, because that's where it's more common to happen, right? Therefore, not a big deal. Oh, we're splitting up the Mishnah, establishing it differently. No, it makes more sense. We're not saying, oh, the first part of Mishnah is A and B, and the second part is B. That doesn't really sit well with us. But over here, because it goes well with the case, it makes more sense. Bring proof. If the buyer pulled the seller's donkey drivers and the guys who are donkeys and the people who are helping bring the produce, the delivery guy, he brings the seller's Amazon truck, he brings it into his house. Then pasak of shalom, whether or not he set the price without measuring it, or whether he measured it without setting the price. They both can still retract because there's no kinyan. Pirkan, if he unloaded it from the donkey, especially sometimes when he put it in his house, if he set the price beforehand, you can't retract because it was done. If you measure without the price, you both can retract because unless you make a price, there's no sale. Now the Gemara says, we see from the Braita the case of the seller's utensil in the buyer's property, you don't acquire it. And we said that the same halachot apply vice versa. Therefore, we see from here as well that the reverse case, the buyer's utensil in the seller's property also should not acquire. Where it says Amar Rahman Bar Yitzhak, no, the case is B'Sheh Shefachan. He spilled the fruits out of the seller's bags onto the buyer's house. And therefore, in that case, there's no utensil happening, it's directly into my house, and that's why I acquire it. Where it says Ipkir Ravad didn't like that. Midi Shefchan Ktani, the Mishnah doesn't, the Braita doesn't say you spilled it into his property. Pirikan Ktani, he said unloaded it, seemingly in the bag. Where it says we're talking about cases of like bundles of garlic or those type of items which come in their own packaging, i.e., they're packaged by themselves. And therefore, there is no sacks. Therefore, there is no utensils. And therefore, once I take it off the donkey and I put it into my property, it's already my property without the seller's utensil. Okay. Let's see. The Mishnah said that you specifically unloaded it into the buyer's property. Mali pasak, what's the difference whether or not you set the price? You should acquire it regardless. The Gemara says no. We mentioned this, we hinted at this earlier, but now we're explaining it. Why does it make a difference whether or not I set a price? Because if I'm setting a price, then when I bring it into my property, me and the seller are both setting our mind that the situation and the sale is done and the price and the sale goes through. But if not, then no. Amar Ravina Vashe. Tashma is being approved. The Rav Shmuel, the Rav Shmuel both said, a person's item can acquire from anywhere except in public. What does it mean anywhere? Just say person's item can buy everywhere, and that's it. You don't have to say a person's item can acquire for him. Period. Why you say everywhere in any place, any place where it says it's seemingly that not that tuye, things like even including the case where it's the seller's property. Trying to bring a proof. The Gemara says not a good proof. The only time that it can work in the seller's property is if the guy specifically specifies to the seller to the buyer, go acquire with your utensil in my property. But without that, in the cases that we've been mentioning until now, where it doesn't work with the buyer's utensil in the seller's property, is talking about where he did not tell him at all. Amen.